Rain had soaked the city like a quiet grief, the kind that seeped into every crack of pavement and every corner of the soul, and as the train platform filled with umbrellas and hurried footsteps, Mahur stood silently near the edge, her soaked dupatta clinging to her shoulders, her eyes heavy from another night of unanswered job applications and a landlord who had left her 3 voicemails reminding her rent was due in 2 days. She had just one last ride home after another failed interview, and the weight of being invisible in a city that never looked up was beginning to crush her. She gripped the pole as the train arrived, its doors groaning open, and the wave of passengers poured out. Mahur found a seat near the window, clutching her file of certificates, hoping for a dry patch of rest when she noticed them. The man was tall, disheveled, yet striking in a way that seemed too weary to care, his black coat soaked through his arms, tightly wrapped around a boy no older than 6, the child's head resting on his shoulders, shivering despite the layers of clothes wrapped around his tiny frame. There was something in the way. As the man looked down at the boy, something achingly gentle, like someone who had learned to love by protecting. And Mahur, without even thinking, stood up and walked toward them. "Here," she said to the man softly, "you and your son can sit here." The man blinked, surprised, then nodded with quiet gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice rich and low as he slid into the seat with his son still curled into his chest. Mahur moved to the corner near the door, holding onto the rail as the train jerked forward. Her hands cold, her shoes soaked, but her heart inexplicably warmer. She looked once more at the boy and saw that he had opened his eyes, his gaze curious, his cheek resting now against his father's arm. They looked like they didn't belong here, like they had wandered into this broken metal box from some other world where suits and shoes were. Dry and time was kinder. Minutes passed, the train rattled on, and the man looked up toward Mahur and said softly, "Would you like to sit now, please?" He motioned gently. "I can stand." Mahur shook her head, smiling faintly. "You both need it more than I do." He opened his mouth as if to insist, but the boy tugged at his sleeve. "Papa, let her stand, it's okay." The man gave a soft nod and turned back toward his son. Mahur noticed then the deep lines under his eyes, not just from tiredness, but something deeper, loss maybe, or heartbreak, or both. And as they sat in silence, the train sliding into tunnels, Mahur watched the world blur behind raindrops and tried to forget how her world was unraveling. She hadn't eaten all day, except for the tea from the interview office and the biscuit packet she'd stretched from morning. But she felt oddly full now, like that one act of kindness had fed something she didn't know was starving. When the train jerked again and the boy stirred awake, he looked at Mahur and asked, "Why did you give us your seat? Aren't you tired?" Mahur bent slightly and said, "Because kindness is free, and sometimes it's the only thing we have left." The boy blinked as if memorizing her words before leaning against his father. Again the man looked at her for a long moment and then reached into his coat, pulling out a small card. "It's nothing much," he said, "just to thank you, and in case you ever need help, I run a few things." Mahur looked at the card, but the train lights flickered, and she stuffed it into her file without reading it later. At home, soaked cold, hungry, and curled in the corner of her small room, she pulled out the card absent-mindedly and looked at the name embossed in gold: Armand Zion, CEO Ziontech. Her breath caught, her chest tightened. Ziontech. It's one of the top companies in the city, with headlines about their innovations and a recent acquisition that had rocked the stock markets, and she had just given up her seat to the man who ran it. All she stared at the card, disbelief crawling over her skin. Had she been too forward, had he thought? She was angling for something, but no, she hadn't even read the card. She had acted from a place that was deeper than strategy. It was human instinct. She tried to sleep, but the face of the little boy in the quiet storm behind the man's eyes haunted her dreams. The next morning she woke up to find her phone blinking with a message from an unknown number. "Thank you again for your kindness. If you ever want to visit the office just for coffee or conversation, the offer stands." She blinked, stunned, reading it twice, then again. Coffee or conversation? What kind of CEO says that? She spent hours debating it, pacing her small space, listening to the rain outside. Finally, with trembling fingers, she typed a reply, "Thank you. I'd like that, maybe sometime soon," and pressed send. She didn't expect a reply immediately, but it came within minutes. "Tomorrow noon. I'll have my assistant expect." Pressure. Mahur stared at the message. Was this real? Was she hallucinating out of hunger? But the next morning, dressed in her one formal kurti and borrowed shoes, she stood outside the towering glass building, heart thudding as she stepped. Inside, the receptionist greeted her with a smile. "Mr. Zion is expecting you. Please take the elevator to the top floor." Her legs moved on autopilot. The elevator. Opening into a floor bathed in light, soft carpet and minimalist furniture, she was ushered into a room where Armin stood by the window, his back to her. He turned slowly, smiling gently. "I wasn't sure if you'd come," Maher shrugged. "I wasn't sure either." They sat down and he poured tea himself, not calling an assistant, not playing the powerful executive. And in that moment, something shifted. The man who had once been a stranger on a train began telling her about the little boy. His name was Rayon. His only son, his wife, had passed 2 years ago in a car crash. And since then, Armin had tried to be both mother and father while running a company that never slept. "I never take the train," he admitted, "but that day my car broke down and I didn't want to wait. I had meetings. I had my son and the rain didn't feel so heavy until I stepped into that train and found someone had saved a space for us." Mahor listened, her heart opening, not out of sympathy, but something closer to understanding, the kind that only pain can teach. "I know what it's like to feel invisible," she said. Quietly, he looked at her and nodded slowly, and that was how their strange meetings began. Once a week at first, then more often. Armand would invite her to the office to test coffee blends for his pantry, to look over designs for a new app he was testing, but more than that, he listened to her stories, her struggles, her dreams of working in branding and design, the unpaid internships, the disappointments, the quiet dignity she wrapped around her hunger. Rayon grew fond of her, to drawing pictures of them together, leaving crayon notes in her file, and one day he asked, "Papa, can she come to my school play? She's nicer than Auntie." Simran Arman laughed and said, "Only if she wants to," and when Maher said yes, Rayon hugged her tightly and whispered, "You're like sunshine in my rain." Mahor swallowed tears she hadn't expected, and as weeks passed, her life began to bloom. Quietly, Armand offered her a project, a paid internship, then a contract, and slowly a place not just in the office, but in their little world too. He never asked for anything, never crossed a line, always treated her as someone who mattered, not just a passing act of kindness, but a voice, a light. And Meher, who had grown up building walls around her dreams, found herself sketching those dreams now in colors she had forgotten existed. Late one evening, as they stood watching the city lights from his office balcony, Armand said, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't offered that seat?" Meher smiled softly. "I don't wonder. I just know it was the only thing I could do." He looked at her then with a kind of awe and said, "I've built buildings, signed deals, changed lives, but no one has ever changed mine. It's the way you did." Meher didn't know what to say. So she looked away. The rain had stopped that night, but in her heart, something else had begun to fall, a soft, unfamiliar storm of hope. And as they stood in silence, a man, a woman, a boy in a city full of noise, Mahor realized that sometimes it takes a stranger to make you feel seen, and sometimes a single seat on a crowded train is the beginning of everything. The seasons had begun to change, and so had Medher's world, not with noise or fireworks, but with quiet transformations, so subtle that she often didn't realize how far she'd come until looked back and remembered the girl who once stood on a rain-drenched train platform with soaked shoes and an empty heart. Now she walked into glass buildings not as an applicant, but as someone whose ideas mattered, whose voice echoed in boardrooms, and whose presence brought calm like morning light. Spilling through heavy curtains, Armin's office had become a second home, not because of the decor or the status, but because of the people within it. Armin himself had grown softer in her presence, not weaker, but warmer, like a fire that doesn't burn but invites you to sit close. And Rayan had wrapped himself around her life like a vine of joy, growing steadily stronger, his laughter filling corners of her heart she hadn't known were empty, and every time he called her her mama, she felt something deeper than happiness, something that felt like healing. And yet, despite all the progress, all the laughter and growing closeness, Mehar remained cautious, not because she doubted Arman or Rayon, but because for the first time in her life, she had something to lose, something she wasn't ready to live without, and that kind of love both gave her wings and tied knots in her stomach. She found herself thinking of them all the time, not just when they were near, but in the smallest moments. Like when she passed a toy store and wondered if Rayan would like the new dinosaur puzzle, or when she saw a raincoat in the market and thought it would suit Armand better than his worn black one, or when she made chai and added 2 extra spoons of sugar, just the way Rayan liked it, even if he wasn't there. Mahar had grown used to solitude, but now silence felt a little heavier. When they weren't around, and yet she didn't speak of it because she didn't want to ruin the delicate balance that had formed naturally between them. She had been given a place in their lives, and she didn't want to ask for more, lest it be taken away. And Armand, as perceptive as ever, noticed the hesitation in her eyes, the way her smiles faltered when goodbyes came, the way she held herself slightly back when Joy knocked at the door. And one evening, after a long meeting, as they sat sipping coffee under the office skylight, Armand asked her what scares you, met her, and she laughed softly without humor and said, having something this beautiful and losing it. Armand looked at her for a long moment, then placed his cup down gently and said, I lost everything once, Meher, my wife, my faith in love, my sense of family, and I never thought I'd find it again. But you and Rayan gave me that back without asking for anything in return. I will never let go of this unless you ask me to. Gosh. Mahor looked at him, eyes glistening, heart thudding, unsure whether to cry or smile, and when Rayan ran in moments later, holding a painting he made of the 3 of them standing on a train, she knew that life had already chosen for her the train scene. It wasn't just a memory. It was a beginning etched now in crayon and love. And so they became something more than just 3 people connected by a moment. They became a story unfolding each day, with new lines and shared chapters. Mahor began spending more time at their home, not as a guest, but as someone who belonged. She helped Rayan with homework, cooked with Armand on Sunday mornings, and even redecorated the living room with little plants she believed brought luck, and the space began to reflect something unspoken. A harmony, a belonging, a home. One night, as they were putting Rayan to bed, he looked up sleepily and said, if we were a family, what would that make you? And Mahar smiled, brushing hair from his forehead, and whispered, what do you want it to make me? And he said, I want you to be my forever, Mahar mama. And then he fell asleep, not knowing he'd changed her life with 7 simple words. And Armand, who had stood silently in the doorway, came in and wrapped his arms around her, not tightly, not desperately, just enough to tell her that she wasn't dreaming. And as they stood in the quiet glow of the night, Mahor felt the fear in her heart slowly replaced by something sturdier, something like hope the next morning brought. A different kind of storm, not of weather, but of fate. A news article had surfaced online, linking Armand to an old business deal his competitors twisted to make him look corrupt. The headlines screamed betrayal, and social media Zion Tech demanding answers. Armand stayed calm as always, addressing his team with quiet dignity, but Mahar could see the storm behind his eyes, the fear not for himself but for what it might do to Rayan, to Mahar, to everything they'd built. She stayed by his side, through it all, refusing to disappear when things got messy, writing heartfelt statements, helping the PR team, crafting posts that reminded the public of the truth. Not Armand faced the press. He didn't go alone. He stood with Mahar beside him, her presence silent but powerful. And when he spoke of integrity and struggle and loss and second chances, people began to listen. Charities all standing by him, and within days the narrative had changed from suspicion to strength. And when the dust settled and the office resumed its calm, Armand took Melhar's hands in his and said, I could have fought this alone, but I never want to fight alone again. Not when I have you. Maher's eyes welled up, and she whispered, I didn't do it for thanks. I did it because I believe in you. And Armand smiled then, really smiled, the kind that reached his eyes and pulled her into an embrace. That felt like the world stopping. Maher began receiving offers from other companies. Now, journalists wanted her story blogs, featured her rise from train platform to tech influencer, but she stayed grounded, knowing that fame wasn't her finish line. It was the work that mattered, the impact, the change she could bring. And beside Armand and Rayan, she found ways to make it all meaningful together. They launched a foundation to support women in tech, offering scholarships, mentorship, and community. Mahor led it with a grace that inspired everyone, and in every speech she gave, she reminded them that kindness is never wasted. It always returns, sometimes in ways you never imagined. Meanwhile, Rian continued growing into the kind of boy who left extra sandwiches in his lunchbox for kids who forgot theirs, who told his teachers stories of how his Mayhor
Oh, Mama saved his
Papa, and who drew a new picture every week of their family, always with the same three figures, holding hands, Meher Arman.
and ran one night under the same stars that had once watched over them on the hotel rooftop. Armand took her for a walk to the same train station. Where they had first met, the rain had just ended, and the streets glistened in the light. He looked at her and said, "I never believed in fate, Mahor, until that day, until you," and she smiled, saying, "I never believed in love until you," and he dropped to one knee, holding a ring not flashy, but elegant, simple, and honest, like the life they were building together, and asked, "Not will you marry me, but will you build forever with us?" And Mayhor nodded, unable to speak, tears pouring down her face as Rayan ran out from behind a bench, holding flowers, shouting, say yes," and she laughed through her tears and whispered, "I already did when I gave up that seat," and so began a new chapter, not of endings, but beginnings, written not in crayon or contracts, but in the quiet rhythm of shared days and nights, of three hearts beating in sync of laughter. Around dinner tables, bedtime stories, whispered prayers, and dreams finally spoken aloud and chased together. Mahar, who once stood soaked and forgotten on a train, now stood hand in hand with a man and a boy who had given her the world not in riches or titles, but in love and belonging. And as they walked back to their car that night, under a sky that had never looked more beautiful, she looked up, closed her eyes, and silently thanked whatever force had led her to that moment, because kindness had brought them together, love had kept them close, and now nothing, not even time, could take that away. The wedding was not a spectacle. It was not held in grand hotels or under chandeliers. Instead, it was beneath a canopy of soft golden lights in Armin's garden, where jasmine floated on the breeze, and Rayan stood proudly between them, holding a ring box in his tiny hands as if it contained the entire future, and maybe it did. Mahar wore a simple, off-white sari with a blue border, the same shade as the scarf she'd worn on the train that day, the day everything began, and Arman wore a navy blue sherwani stitched with such subtle elegance that it felt less like clothing and more like memory woven into fabric. Close friends, family, colleagues, and the team who had built dreams with Mihor gathered under the open sky to witness what they all knew was not just a wedding, but a union of something already sacred. And as Mayhor and Armin looked at each other, hands trembling, voices soft, Rayan tugged at their clothes and said, "You forgot to say forever." So they laughed and added that word to their vows, and when the ceremony ended, there were no fireworks, just soft music and heartfelt embraces, and a boy who danced between them as if the world had finally settled into place after years of being out of rhythm. And in the days that followed, life didn't suddenly become perfect, because life never does, but it became real and shared and full of small wonders, like Rayan making breakfast on Sundays with more mess than food, or Meher and Armand disagreeing over whether to buy more plants or books, or the way Armin sometimes stared at Mayhor as if still wondering whether this was all a dream that might vanish if he blinked, and Mayhor didn't float through it all. She remained grounded, driven, full of ideas and ambition. And now, with Armin's full support and partnership, she expanded the Women's Foundation into 3 more cities, adding tech labs, digital storytelling courses, and even childcare centers for working mothers. And every time a girl smiled holding her first laptop, Mahor felt like a small corner of the world had been rewritten. Meanwhile, Rayan grew fast, curious, always asking questions, from why the sky is blue to how kindness works. And Mayhor tried to answer each one, not as a mother who knew everything, but as someone who had once lived in shadows and found light by accident. And one evening, as Rayan sat on her lap, watching old family videos, he turned and asked, "Will I ever forget my first mama?" And Mayhor paused, hugged him close, and said, "Never. Love isn't something you run out of. Your heart makes more room." He nodded like he understood too deeply for his age, and whispered, "I have 2 now, and both make me feel safe." And Meher cried silently that night, not out of sadness, but because love had bloomed in her life in the most honest way, without force, without pretending, just by showing up again and again when it mattered. Armin had his own transformations too, no longer the untouchable CEO who carried the weight of his past in silence. He now laughed more, cried openly when touched by stories from the Women's Initiative, spent hours planning school events with Meher, and sometimes even switched off his phone for entire weekends just to cook silly meals with Rayan and build Lego towers until midnight. And in these moments, Meher would look around the room and feel something deeper than gratitude, something like grace, because she hadn't just been rescued from her loneliness. She had rescued them too. And together they had formed a circle of safety and joy. And one morning as Arman walked into her new studio, a creative space she'd built with the help of her foundation, he placed an old train ticket on her desk, faded, crumpled, but real, and said, "I kept this from the day we met. It reminded me that miracles don't always come loudly. Sometimes they come holding a file and offering their seat." And Mehor placed it into a frame, whispering that she'd keep it on the wall to remind every girl who walked in here that her journey could begin anywhere, even on a train drenched in rain years. Passed gently and beautifully, with challenges that felt less like storms and more like puzzles they could solve together. Rayan became a teenager, his voice changing, his mind opening. He started volunteering at the foundation, helping younger kids learn computers and drawing charts on how kindness impacts brain chemistry. A project that made his teachers cry, and when asked where he got the idea, he simply said, "My family taught me that kindness saves lives." And Mehor and Arman stood in the back row of the auditorium holding hands as Rayhan presented, feeling both old and new again, because their boy wasn't just growing, he was carrying the best of them forward, and Mehor's story was now being told beyond their city. Invited to speak at global conferences, she traveled to Europe, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, telling women how she went from a rejected job applicant to a changemaker. And every time she spoke, her voice was steady, but her heart trembled, remembering the girl who once thought survival was the highest dream she could afford. And after every speech, she'd get messages from strangers saying, "You gave me hope, you made me believe in new chances." And she'd reply with humility, always adding that it wasn't just her, but a man and a boy who saw her not as charity, but as change, and who gave her the world not with diamonds or wealth, but with presence and patience. In real love, and at home their traditions grew deeper. Friday night story sessions with Rhea and Sunday brunches with their growing extended family, and an annual visit to Rhea, that same train station where it had all begun. They'd stand there quietly, watch the trains pass, and then walk to a tea stall where Rayan would order 3 cups and say, "This is where my family started, right here," with a seat and a smile. And one summer they turned that memory into a campaign called Small Kindness Big Change, featuring real stories of strangers who helped others without expecting anything, and how those single moments reshaped entire lives. It went viral, led to a book deal, and later a short film that won awards. And as Meher watched the premiere on a soft theater screen sitting between Arman and Rayan, her eyes filled again, because seeing her life replayed in light and color reminded her that magic doesn't always need wands. Sometimes it just needs timing and a heart that still dares to open after being hurt. And in quiet moments, when Arman woke up before dawn, he'd watch Mehor, sleeping hair spread across the pillow, and think of how long he'd lived in grayscale before she arrived and filled his world with color. And sometimes, when Mehor watched Arman tell bedtime stories to Rayan, or argue with him over which ice cream flavor to choose, she'd think about how she used to pray just for one day of peace, and now she had a lifetime of it, wrapped in chaos, love, mess, and Wes. Truth. And one winter, as the city celebrated New Year's Eve with fireworks from rooftops, they sat together on a picnic blanket in the garden, sipping hot cocoa wrapped in shawls. And Rayan said, "This was our best year ever, but I think next year will be even better." And Arman laughed. "Why?" And he said, "Because we keep loving more every year." And Mehar kissed his forehead, whispered, "Exactly." And that night they wrote letters to themselves, sealed them in envelopes to be opened next year, a tradition Rayan invented. And Mehar's letter simply said, "Thank you for not giving up even when it hurt, because look where we are now." And the years continued as years do bring in gray hair and new dreams, but the essence remained untouched, rooted in that one act of giving up a seat on a rainy day. And one evening, when Meher stood in front of a new batch of scholarship students, She told them never underestimate your smallest decisions. One seat, one gesture, one word can alter everything, not just for you, but for the world around you. And as she spoke, her voice rang strong, but her thoughts wandered to a boy who once shivered in his father's arms, and a man who had lost everything, but still carried grace in his silence, and to a girl who offered a place not knowing she'd be given a home. And later, as they walked home together past busy streets, laughter in the air, Maher, Arman, and Rayon, holding hands like always, she turned back just once to look at the city behind them and whispered, "Thank you." And Arman asked, "For what?" And she said, "For noticing me when I was just a stranger." And Arman stopped, kissed her hand, and said, "You were never just a stranger, Maher. You were the answer to a prayer I didn't know I'd whispered." And Rayhan added, "And you were the missing piece to our happy," and Messer laughed, tears brimming, as she said then, "Let's keep building the rest." And in that moment, beneath the streetlights and the hum of a world that kept moving, they stood still, three souls woven by fate, stitched by kindness, and sealed by love. And the world didn't notice, because it never does. But sometimes the biggest stories are the quietest ones. And this one began not with a fairy tale or grand gesture, but with a tired girl, a rainy train, and a seat freely given. And in the end, she didn't just give up her seat, she gave her heart and got the world in return.